That's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind.
This is the famous quote of Neil Armstrong as he becomes the first man to ever walk on the moon's surface. This is the result of 8.5 years of money and dedication. The story behind this miraculous American achievement is incredibly amazing. This story starts in 1957, where the Second World War comes to a close, and we see two powerful nations emerging. One is the communist Soviet Union of the East, and the other is the democratic United States of the West. With the invention of nuclear warfare, violence on battlefields was now irrelevant, and the two nations now fight for power through technological and political advancements, both trying to prove to potential allies that they are superior. All of this was what came to form the well-known Cold War. This is the story that tells us why the United States decided to go to the moon, and how the Cold War paranoia formed a technological race with the Soviet Union to get to the moon, and how the rockets we built got us there just in time to win the race. All in all, this will give us the full story of America's journey to the moon. To understand why the United States dedicated so much effort and money on space exploration and a successful lunar landing, we first have to go back all the way to the beginning, when a hollow metal beach ball was sent into the Earth's orbit. On October 4th, 1957, the Soviet Union sent the world's first artificial satellite into Earth's orbit, called Sputnik, meaning fellow traveler in Russian. Millions of people around the world watched as the Soviet Union launched their 110-foot Semyorka rocket, which was originally made to launch nuclear warheads. The rocket was used to send the 184-pound Sputnik into Earth's orbit. Suddenly, the previously victorious United States was now very behind in the new formed Cold War.
I think people overall were shocked. I mean, they had no idea that, and I think they just didn't want to believe that the Russians were that capable.
During the end of World War II, a German scientist named Wernher von Braun was able to invent an incredibly powerful rocket that could carry bombs over very large distances. Germany then went on to manufacture thousands and thousands of these rockets as the World War progressed. However, near the end of the war, it became obvious that Germany was going to lose the war, and therefore the Soviet Union and the United States both were eager to take over the German technology and their scientists. In a US World War II operation called Operation Paperclip, the United States was able to claim many of the Germans' rockets as well as their scientists, including von Braun. However, the Soviet Union also had their own ingenious rocket scientist, named Sergei Korolev, who was the person responsible for the Soviet Union's Sputnik launch. With the help of von Braun and resources from the US Navy, on December 6, 1957, the US planned to send their own satellite into space with their nuke rocket called Vanguard. Liftoff, the rocket only goes about 4 feet up after shattering back down to the ground in a massive explosion. A new rocket, created only a few months later, flew for about a minute before exploding into flames mid-flight. By now, the United States were already starting to lose hope. Many newspapers at the time called the Vanguard series a flopnik or kaputnik. However, on January 31st, 1958, the United States got a glimmer of hope. Von Braun and his team of scientists managed to create a Redstone rocket called Vanguard 2 that successfully launched their satellite Explorer 1 into the Earth's orbit. The Explorer 1 satellite was about 30 pounds and 80 feet in length. It was designed by the physicist William F. Pickering, and it was the first satellite to ever gather information about space. And unlike Sputnik, which only lasted about 9 weeks in orbit, Explorer 1 lasted a full 4 months until falling down to Earth's surface and burning up in the atmosphere. Honestly, Explorer 1 was a big step for space exploration in the US, which caused the United States to be more dedicated towards space exploration. That's why in 1958, President Dwight D. Eisenhower decided to create a NASA, or the National Aeronautics and Space Administration, as a federal agency that focused on space exploration. Immediately after its creation, NASA started to work on Project Mercury, which goal to get the first man into space. It was clear that the Soviets were already on their way to put a human into orbit, so action needed to be done very quickly. However, the first thing that needed to be sorted out was to figure out what type of person was capable of going into space. This person needed to be capable of dealing with high pressure and dangerous situations, and needed to understand the mechanics of aircrafts and machinery to be able to make mid-flight decisions very quickly. After considering many other options, NASA eventually decided that the best option was military test pilots. Not only did they meet with the requirements perfectly, but there were also a large quantity of them as the US just came out of the Second World War. From here, the testing of military pilots began. The testing first looked at all 508 applicants, choosing only 36 of them to go into the next round of testing, which was taking place in Lovelace Clinic in Albuquerque, New Mexico. In this round, the 36 candidates would go through a series of difficult exams, which would both show the pilot's mental and physical capabilities. Finally, out of the 18 top scorers, the 7 final candidates were chosen. These candidates, titled the Mercury 7, were announced to the world on April 9, 1959, where they immediately became national heroes. However, even though one of these candidates was soon to be the first man in space, over the next 2 years, NASA couldn't seem to bring a Mercury project rocket to a success, with each rocket growing up bigger than the previous. Meanwhile, the Soviet Union is going full speed ahead with space advancements. In the November of 1957, Soviets sent Sputnik 2 into space, and this time they put a dog named Lakia inside, which made them the first nation to send an animal into space. In the September of 1959, the Soviet Union launches Luna 2, which becomes the first space probe to ever land on the moon's surface. In the August of 1960, the Soviet Union sent 47 animals into Earth's orbit for 24 hours, including 2 dogs named Belka and Strelka. And on April 12, 1961, the Soviet Union sent Yuri Gagarin, which flies on Vostok 1 and orbited Earth for over 2 hours, becoming the first human to ever go into outer space. At this point, the United States were a long way behind the Soviets in the space race, and it was only until the January of 1961 that NASA was able to create a successful rocket. However, since using a human for flight was too risky at the time, NASA decided to put a chimpanzee named Ham into the rocket instead. Ham successfully launches and becomes the first chimpanzee into space, and the first to ever come back alive and healthy. This success was exactly what the United States needed to catch up with the Soviet Union, and on May 5th, NASA launched the Mercury 7's top pilot, Alan B. Shepard Jr., on Freedom 7. The flight was delayed about 4 hours. However, at 9:34 p.m., Shepard was launched into space, about 3 weeks after Gagarin's flight. 45 million Americans watched as Shepard becomes the first American to ever visit outer space. Even though it was a major success, Shepard's suborbital flight was not nearly enough to beat Gagarin's orbital flight. Therefore, the United States needed to make some major decisions, and they needed to make them fast. So, only 20 days after Shepard's flight, President John F. Kennedy made a speech that changed everything.
We choose to go to the moon. We choose to go to the moon. We choose to go to the moon in this decade and do the other things, not because they are easy, but because they are hard.
That was quite a bold statement, and he actually made that statement in Houston, Texas. So, and I saw it, and I thought that's a really, really fantastic idea, and I know that's what we were trying to do. But by the end of the century, half years to do it, and we haven't even put a man in orbit around the Earth yet.
And with these famous words, the objective of the space race now suddenly switched to landing a man on the moon and bringing him back safely down to Earth. For another 2 years, the United States continues to catch up with the Russians, having 6 more successful manned flights, including the famous trip of John Glenn Jr., who rode Friendship 7, and became the first American to ever orbit the Earth, finally matching up with Gagarin's flight. Starting from the year of 1967, NASA started working on a series of space launches called the Apollo series. To create a rocket powerful enough to get a human to the moon is very difficult, and needs lots of trial and error. When testing the Saturn V rocket, which was the rocket used to launch the Apollo spacecrafts, there was not enough time to test each stage of the rocket, like von Braun wanted to. NASA was coming close to this end of the decade deadline, and there was no time to spare, with the Soviet Union advancing very quickly.
It was all very complex and very, very time dependent and very resource constrained.
The Apollo manager, Dr. George Mueller, came up with the risky idea of testing all the stages of the Saturn V rocket at the same time. This was a very dangerous idea, as one small error in one of the stages could cause a massive explosion. However, the test luckily went on successful, and on November 9, 1967, the Saturn V rocket launched a non-crewed Apollo 4 spacecraft into space and back down perfectly. And after this, 2 more Saturn V rockets successfully launched Apollo spacecrafts 5 and 6 into space. Then, on October 11, 1968, Apollo 7 was launched by Saturn IB, a more efficient rocket. This became the first crewed Apollo flight. And on December 21st, 1968, Apollo 8 was launched with Saturn V. Apollo 8 was originally supposed to be an Earth orbital mission. However, rumors came from Russia that the Soviet Union was already working on a rocket to reach the moon, and therefore NASA decided to change plans and move it to a lunar orbital mission, meaning that the rocket would need to travel over 238,000 miles farther. However, on launch day, Apollo 8, which carried Frank Borman, Jim Lovell, and Bull Anderis, were successfully sent to the moon and orbited 10 times before reaching back safely to Earth. And after test launches, Apollo 9 and 10 were successful and finished, NASA started preparing for Apollo 11, the final moon mission. The objective on Apollo 11 was to not only get to the moon, but to land there safely, perform specific tasks, and then return back to Earth safely. Meanwhile, the Soviets are continuously trying to maintain their lead. However, by the launch of Apollo 11, they had failed many times to get their massive rocket to launch and get to the moon.
So they had a hard time lifting enough weight to get all the way to the moon and then come back.
However, the United States had no room for failure. With the president's deadline coming up soon, it was crucial for Apollo 11 to be a success on its first attempt. Apollo 11 was also planned to be launched by Saturn V, which was a 6.5 million pound rocket designed based off of the Germans' previous World War II V-2 rocket. Unlike the Soviets, the United States broadcasted the scene on live TV as NASA prepared Apollo 11 spacecraft in Cape Kennedy, Florida on July 16th of 1969.
When the United States did something, everybody was watching us. Everybody was watching what we did. We weren't doing anything in secret,
Inside the shuttle were astronauts Neil A. Armstrong, Edwin or Buzz Aldrin Jr., and Michael Collins, who were all preparing for a long and dangerous journey ahead. And finally, on 8:32 a.m., the final countdown for launch was called, and the rockets of the Apollo Saturn V boomed, launching the spacecraft into the depths of space. However, to understand the full, long, and stressful journey of these 3 courageous astronauts, we first have to examine the anatomy of the Saturn V rocket and the Apollo 11 spacecraft. First, let's look at the Saturn V rocket itself. Standing at approximately 363 feet tall, this massive rocket was split into 3 different subsections or phases. First and biggest stage of the rocket is phase SIC, which is built by the Boeing company, which is why it is sometimes referred as the Boeing stage. The SIC is the most powerful of Saturn V phases and will be used at liftoff and to escape the Earth's atmosphere. The second stage, SII, was also sometimes called the North American stage, as it was manufactured by the North American Aviation. This rocket was a bit smaller than the SIC and stood only about 81.6 feet tall. This rocket is also very less powerful and will only be used to finish the work of SIC and get through the upper atmosphere of Earth. And finally, at the top of the rocket is the SIVB stage, which is the third and final stage. This stage was also named Douglas as it was manufactured by the Douglas Aircraft Company. The rocket was only about 58.6 feet tall, which was very small compared to the other 2 stages. SIVB only had one small J2 engine that would fly for a short amount of time to bring the spacecraft into Earth's orbit. Now for the anatomy of the actual Apollo 11 spacecraft, which like the rocket also had 3 main parts. At the bottom was the lunar module, which would hold the Lunar Roving Vehicle, or the LRV for short. The LRV was also known as the Eagle and was the vehicle that the astronauts would use to drive on the moon. Right above the lunar module is the service module, where all the calculations, calibrations, and system checks would be done mid-flight. Finally, at the top of the spacecraft is the command module, which is where the astronauts would stay for most of their journey. On the top of the command module was also a launch escape system, which would pull the command module away from the rocket in case of emergencies such as explosions. And now we can start at the beginning. Mission Control signals liftoff and the SIC rocket roars and brings the rocket up to space. With a speed of about 6,000 miles per hour, the first stage of the Saturn V reaches about 42 miles or 68 kilometers above Earth's surface before detaching from the rest of the rocket. Here, stage SII, or the second stage, is initiated, bringing the rocket to about 103 miles or 166 kilometers above Earth's surface. By now, the launch escape system was no longer needed anymore, and it detached from the spacecraft. And after about 6 minutes, the second stage was also discarded, leaving it up to stage SIVB to fly briefly and thrust Apollo into Earth's orbit. Now in orbit, the 3 astronauts checked in with Mission Control and transferred to the service module to check for any errors. Now, from here, the next step was to leave Earth's orbit to the moon in the most fuel-efficient way. To do this, they needed to go on a precise trajectory called the translunar injection. And after about 2 hours of orbiting the Earth, the SIVB rocket roared again, escaping Earth's orbit and flying perfectly on the translunar injection. Now here comes the tricky part. Once away from the Earth, the spacecraft needed to be reconfigured in order to successfully land on the moon. Right now, the LRV was stored away inside of the lunar module. However, it needed to be taken out in order for the astronauts to access it during their landing. To do this, the command and service modules of the spacecraft detached from the lunar module. Here, the connected command and service modules turned a full 180 degrees and docked with the LRV and pulled it out. Once fully pulled out, the third rocket stage was discarded, leaving only the Apollo 11 spacecraft itself. And for the next 3 full days, the remaining Apollo spacecraft drifts through the depths of space. And finally, on July 20th of 1969, the astronauts reached the moon and entered its orbit. Here, the astronauts separate. Aldrin and Armstrong transfer to the LRV, while Collins continues in the command module. Now, this was another hard part of the journey. Once everything was prepared and ready, Armstrong and Aldrin start falling down to the lunar surface on the LRV. The rockets on the LRV initiated and the rover flipped over so that the rocket was on the bottom. From here, the rocket slowly brought the rover closer and closer to the ground. However, there was a major problem. As the rover was reaching the surface, Mission Control received the message that the entire engine only had about 2 minutes of flight time left. And with over 200 feet left to go, Armstrong and Aldrin quickly lowered the rover, and with only about 15 seconds of airtime left, the rover safely touches the lunar surface and lands. With the LRV now on the ground safely, Mission Control takes a large sigh of relief, and Armstrong and Aldrin prepare to exit the rover. And when fully ready, Armstrong opens the hatch and takes one large leap outwards on the lunar surface, reciting the famous quote we all know today.
It's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind.
Armstrong's historic moment was watched by the entire world, as the lunar rover sends live video footage to television stations all around the world. And a few moments later, Aldrin comes out to join Armstrong on the moon. On their 21-hour moonwalk, the 2 astronauts did a variety of different planned tasks. First, they collected many rock samples from the moon to bring back to Earth for study. Aldrin and Armstrong also took many pictures, notes, and observations to bring back to Earth. Finally, Armstrong and Aldrin worked together and planted the American flag onto the lunar surface, making the United States the first nation to ever land on another landmass in outer space. However, the job was not yet finished. The United States still needed to get their men back to Earth safely in order to finish the space race. Aldrin and Armstrong boarded the lunar module again, and soon later the rocket of the lunar module initiated and the 2 astronauts were off. Now, during this whole time, Collins had been orbiting the moon in the command module. And as the lunar module flies back up into the moon's orbit, the command module meets up with the lunar module, docking once again. After being fully connected, the 2 moonwalkers transfer back into the command module, and the now useless lunar module is discarded, leaving only the service module engine and the command module. And after very precise calculations, the engine of the service module initiated in trajectory for the Earth, which is called the trans-Earth injection. After 2 days of space cruising, the astronauts finally reached the Earth's orbit. Here, the service module detached and the command module started plummeting down into Earth. Protected by its durable heat shield, the command module broke into Earth's atmosphere and headed toward the Pacific Ocean at a speed of over 25,000 miles per hour. Once close enough to Earth's surface, the module's parachutes deployed, and with a splash, 3 astronauts, now American heroes, have made history. The United States have now officially won both the space race and, more importantly, the Cold War, proving to the world how technologically capable their nation really is. The fact that the United States was able to defeat such a powerful and far more advanced nation almost seems unreal at first. However, when you look back to each step the United States took, it's clear to see the reason behind their success.
I think we had 2 things. We had better technology, and we had more dedication and perseverance and commitment to getting it done.
From the very beginning, when Kennedy made his daring statement of going to the moon, this gave the United States a chance to overtake the Soviets. The amount of passion and dedication the United States put into winning the space race was another key factor to our success. And when we look back at the Saturn V rocket and Apollo 11 spacecraft, we can tell exactly how much thought and effort was put into creating a successful rocket to get the first man to the moon. After diving deeper into this topic, I can confidently say that landing on the moon was definitely one of the most influential parts of US history. This is why it's so hard to imagine a world where the United States loses. This US victory is what shaped the world today, as the United States is arguably one of the most technologically and politically advanced nations in the entire world. The Apollo 11 mission has also influenced space exploration today as well. Even as space organizations such as NASA and SpaceX grow and advance, their tactics of space travel is still based off of what the United States did in the 1960s. Before learning about this topic, I never thought about landing on the moon as such a big accomplishment. With all the new advancements in rocket making and Mars landings, a lunar landing didn't seem too revolutionary. However, after learning about all the technological limitations and Cold War paranoia that was incorporated in the success of Apollo 11, I now find it almost impossible to believe that the United States was able to accomplish such a task. The United States' accomplishment of landing on the moon has definitely changed my perspective of both the United States' capability and the importance of dedication in achieving a goal. Even with this country as changed as it is, we still see dedication and potential in today's world as we watch the Perseverance Mars rover successfully land on the moon, or as we observe the United States work hard to spread the COVID-19 vaccines to end a global pandemic. And even as the United States continues to grow and develop, more challenges will emerge in the future, and it's up to us to decide whether we want to rise up to the challenge or crash down as the Soviet rockets did many years ago.